What happens when two of television's most provocative voices collide on live air? And what unfolds when one of them decides he won't play by the host rules anymore? The answer: one of the most explosive moments in talk show history. And it started like any other Friday night taping. The lights in the studio were dimmed just enough to let the glowing backdrop of Los Angeles shine behind the set. Bill Maher stood stage right, sipping from a black coffee mug, scanning his cue cards and sharing a smirk with his producer off camera. The audience had already been warmed up, cheering, clapping, half laughing at the house comedian's last round of jokes. But beneath the laughter, there was a subtle static. Something off. Bill adjusted his suit jacket, cleared his throat, and nodded toward the stage manager. In the wings, Tucker Carlson stood with that familiar half grin, the one millions had seen during primetime hours, but this time, his fingers tapped rapidly against the side of his pants. The moment was charged before a single word had been spoken. Before we unpack the full intensity of what went down between Maher and Carlson and why it's already being called a defining television scandal, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. These are the moments the mainstream won't show you, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Drop a comment below with your initial thoughts. Was Tucker walking into a trap? Or did he trigger the meltdown himself? The intro music kicked in, slick and confident. The crowd cheered as Bill welcomed his controversial guest. Tucker stepped out under the studio lights, waving, smiling, the polished Fox News aura intact. They shook hands like two diplomats pretending to respect each other. At first glance, it was civil, choreographed. But behind Bill's grin was an edge, one that Tucker recognized almost instantly. The stage had been set, the audience was ready, and both men knew someone wasn't leaving this interview quietly. From the moment Tucker Carlson took his seat, the air inside the studio shifted. On the surface, everything appeared cordial, two media titans meeting for a conversation. But anyone paying close attention could feel the tension brewing under the surface. The applause that greeted Tucker's arrival was oddly subdued, almost confused. It wasn't the roaring welcome Maher's guests typically received. Some in the audience clapped out of habit, others hesitated, their smiles uncertain. The producers in the control booth exchanged glances. Something wasn't sinking, and the room could feel it. Tucker, ever composed, crossed his legs and gave a polite nod toward Bill. Maher offered a rehearsed welcome, saying he was thrilled to finally have Tucker on the show, but his tone carried a subtle irony, less invitation, more setup. "You're a man with a lot of opinions," Maher said with a raised brow. Tucker smiled tightly, replying, "So are you, Bill. That's why this will be fun." The audience laughed, but the laughter was hollow, too sharp around the edges. Already the air was becoming electric. Even the stage light seemed hotter than usual. Backstage, a production assistant watching the live feed muttered, "They're circling each other like predators." The floor director noticed Maher wasn't sticking to the agreed-upon opener. Instead of beginning with the usual warm-up on media bias or ratings, Maher pivoted into a dig about Tucker's departure from Fox. It was subtle, but intentional. "So, you're a free agent now," he said, feigning curiosity. "That must be liberating, or lonely?" Tucker tilted his head, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Depends on what you're escaping from." Maher smiled, but it was the kind of smile that precedes a storm. At first, the interview played out like a game of verbal chess, each man advancing pieces, measuring the other's defenses. Maher posed a few softball questions about Carlson's latest media ventures, and Tucker answered with polished precision. They discussed the state of journalism, the erosion of public trust, and even shared mild agreement on the dangers of corporate influence. For a fleeting moment, it seemed this might actually be a productive, if tense, exchange between ideological opposites. But the audience wasn't fooled. They were leaning forward, waiting for the mask to crack. Bill Maher, a seasoned provocateur, knew how to keep the conversation simmering before turning up the heat. He toyed with Carlson's statements, framing them with sly sarcasm. "So, you're the truth teller now?" he asked with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Tucker didn't flinch. "I'm just pointing out what too many are afraid to say." The crowd murmured, unsure whether to laugh or wait. Carlson's calm demeanor wasn't the bluster they'd seen on primetime. It was sharper, more surgical. and Maher was beginning to notice. Between them, the conversation walked a tightrope. There was no shouting yet, no overt insults, but every exchange was more loaded than the last. Maher leaned forward, fingers steepled, like a cat watching a mouse with sharp interest. Do you ever feel responsible, he began slowly, for the rhetoric your audience clings to? Tucker's eyes locked with his. Do you? He fired back. The crowd's reaction was instant, half gasp, half laugh. The polite dance had begun to falter. One misstep now, and it wouldn't be a talk show, it'd be a televised detonation. Bill Maher had a decision to make. Keep the interview on safe terrain or steer it toward the kind of fireworks that boost late-night ratings. He chose the latter. Without warning, he veered from media discourse into Carlson's past statements on immigration. The pivot was sharp, deliberate. You've said things about demographic change that some call dangerous, Maher said, voice heavy with implication. Tucker straightened in his chair. Some people twist honest observations into controversy, he replied, measured but firm. The tension in the room surged like a pressure valve creaking under strain. The audience shifted uneasily. It was no longer a discussion, it was a cross-examination. Maher pushed further, quoting Tucker's most polarizing soundbites back at him, voice laced with disdain. You once said immigration makes the country poorer and dirtier. Do you still stand by that? Tucker blinked slowly, his smile fading into something colder. I said uncontrolled immigration has consequences. That's a fact, not a hate crime. The crowd murmured louder now, some reacting with disapproval, others simply stunned by the boldness. Maher tilted his head, mock sympathy in his tone. Facts are funny things, especially when they come with barbed wire. That line lit the fuse. Carlson's eyes narrowed, his body language stiffening. What's funny, he shot back, is when millionaires in gated communities lecture working Americans about borders. The remark drew gasps, even a few reluctant claps. Maher blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He wasn't used to guests pushing back this hard. Behind the cameras, the director gestured urgently toward the floor team. Something was shifting fast. The conversation had officially crossed the line from discomfort into confrontation. And no one was steering it back. Maher leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk with theatrical patience. The smirk on his face remained, but his eyes had gone colder. You talk about elites, Tucker, but let's be real. You are one, a trust fund baby who made his name punching down. The studio hissed with a collective inhale. The first real blow had landed, and it wasn't veiled in clever wordplay, it was personal. Tucker's lips parted slightly, not in shock, but recognition. The gloves had come off. Carlson responded without raising his voice, which somehow made the moment more piercing. That's rich, Bill. Coming from a guy who built a brand mocking religion, the poor, and anyone who dares to think differently. The crowd buzzed with discomfort. Some laughed nervously, others shifted in their seats. Carlson wasn't retreating, he was matching Maher. Punch for punch, not with fury, but with unnerving calm. Maher's grin twitched. He tried to speak, but Tucker continued, his voice sharper now. I'm not here to make friends with your audience. I'm here because this bubble you live in is choking the country. Behind the scenes, a producer whispered into a headset, Do we cut soon? But the director refused, eyes glued to the monitor. The drama was too compelling. Maher leaned in, his tone suddenly darker. You're not a victim, Tucker. You're a manipulator. And tonight, we're not going to let you hide behind talking points. The line was theatrical, meant to provoke, but Tucker's silence in response was more powerful than anything he could have said. For a moment, the tension dropped into stillness. Then Maher added, quieter this time, Let's see how real you want to get. And just like that, the boundary between showmanship and hostility vanished. Bill Maher sat back with a victorious glint in his eye, the smirk of a man who believed he'd seized the upper hand. He turned to the crowd with a performative shrug, drawing uneasy laughter from the audience. Tucker, meanwhile, didn't blink. His posture tightened, jaw set, eyes locked not on Maher, but on the camera, as if speaking to the viewers at home. This is what passes for open dialogue now? He asked, voice level but loaded. Insults dressed up as questions? The crowd hushed again. The game had changed. Maher tried to regain momentum, lifting his cue cards as if the next line would reset the balance. Come on, Tucker, you've made a career out of skewering people. Can't handle a little heat? The question was thinly veiled provocation, and everyone knew it. Tucker turned toward him slowly. I can handle heat. What I won't do is sit here while you pretend to be interested in debate, when all you're really after is blood for the crowd. He gestured toward the audience without breaking eye contact. They deserve better than this gladiator act. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, confusion mixing with intrigue. Was this still entertainment, or had it become something else entirely? Backstage, Maher's assistant leaned toward a segment producer. He's not folding. He's digging in. The producer nodded, eyes locked on the screen. On stage, Maher's tone shifted, harder now. This is my show. If you don't like the questions, maybe you're in the wrong chair. The studio audience tensed, sensing the temperature rise. Tucker smiled, but the warmth was gone. Maybe I am, he said, voice icy. But you invited me here. Don't act surprised I didn't come to play dead. The studio lights were bright, but it was clear. A storm was gathering, and neither man was backing down. The studio lights dimmed slightly as they cut to commercial, but the air didn't relax. It thickened. Tucker leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes unmoving. Maher turned to his crew, gesturing toward the script with clipped urgency. Cut the next segment. We stay on this. His voice was low, but the microphones nearby still caught pieces of it. Carlson glanced at the host, catching enough to know Maher had no intention of cooling things down. This wasn't an interview anymore, it was a showdown, and the cameras were just another weapon. Behind the curtain, a young intern sprinted down the corridor with an updated cue card while a producer barked into a headset, "We're going live in 40. Keep audience calm." But the audience didn't look calm. Some had stopped clapping entirely, sensing the mood shift from entertainment to something rawer. Maher's stage manager approached, whispering something in his ear. Maher nodded once, his jaw tightening, then turned to sip from his mug, still smirking. Tucker remained motionless. The two men sat on opposite ends of the set, not speaking, barely breathing. The silence between them said more than any headline ever could. In the control booth, a director's assistant muttered, "We're not walking this back." The floor producer didn't respond. She was watching the crowd. Half looked captivated, the other half unsettled. The tension had bled off the stage and into the seats. When the 5-second countdown began, Maher didn't take his eyes off Carlson. "Ready to get real?" he muttered under his breath. Tucker cracked his neck and responded coolly, "I was born ready." The cameras came back on. The crowd straightened in their seats. What came next would fracture the night into before and after. As the show returned from commercial, the energy in the studio didn't reset, it snapped tighter. Bill Maher leaned into the camera with a smug grin, addressing the audience as if nothing had happened. "We're back and things are heating up," he said, faux cheerful while glancing sideways at Tucker. "Let's talk about January 6th, shall we?" The crowd stirred immediately, sensing where this was going. Carlson, now visibly tense, uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. The gloves, it seemed, were gone for good. "I'm not going to let you smear people without context," Tucker said, voice clipped. "That's what media has done for years, reduce everything to villain and victim." Maher cut in. "It was an insurrection, Tucker. What context do you need?" Carlson fired back instantly. "If it were an insurrection, Bill, you'd know it. But you don't want a conversation. You want a confession, and I'm not giving you one." The audience gasped. Some clapped. Others looked around, unsure if they were witnessing performance or collapse. Maher's mouth twitched, but the usual comeback didn't arrive on time. In the control booth, someone muttered, "This isn't good." "This is historic." Back on set, Maher's tone turned acidic. "You don't get to spin your way out of this. People died. Democracy was attacked." Tucker's voice stayed level, but now there was a flash in his eyes. "And you're using it for applause. That's what makes you dangerous, Bill. You wrap your contempt in comedy and call it virtue." The audience fell into an unsettled silence. This wasn't late-night television anymore. This was something else, raw, unfiltered, and no longer under control. Bill Maher sat upright now, his smirk gone. his posture sharpened by visible irritation. Dangerous? He echoed, his voice cutting. You call me dangerous while you've spent years platforming conspiracies that divide this country? Tucker didn't flinch. No, I call you dangerous because you pretend to be above it all, while doing exactly what you accuse others of. You mock, you bait, and then you act surprised when someone pushes back. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others booing, the division audible and intensifying. Maher snapped, You don't get to rewrite history on my stage. This is my platform, not your echo chamber. Tucker raised an eyebrow. Then why invite me here if not to score points? He asked. You wanted a spectacle, Bill. Congratulations. You've got one. The words hung in the air like smoke. Maher tried to move to another question, but his voice wavered slightly. He had underestimated Carlson's resolve, mistaking television polish for pliability. The line between guest and adversary had officially disintegrated. Backstage, a sound technician whispered, Should we mute them? The producer shook her head. Number let it play. The audience was no longer laughing, clapping, or settling into their seats. They were leaning forward, phones half raised, recording what everyone sensed would go viral. Maher leaned in one last time, voice lowered, almost a whisper. You think you're winning, don't you? Tucker answered without hesitation. No, Bill. I think you've already lost. It wasn't a soundbite, it was a verdict. And it turned the studio into a powder keg. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where both men stared at each other in silence, breathing heavily, surrounded by an audience unsure whether to clap or clear their throats. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every inch of rising tension. Bill Maher straightened his jacket as if trying to reset the tone, but the illusion of civility had shattered. You're used to preaching in echo chambers, Tucker, he said, voice cracking slightly. That doesn't work here. Carlson's lips curled into something between a grin and a grimace. I'm not preaching, he said. I'm just not letting you monologue unchallenged. Maher turned to the audience as if to regain control. This is what happens when you give a man a platform and he mistakes it for a pulpit. The laughter he expected didn't come. Instead, the room felt suspended in static. Tucker spoke directly to the crowd, not the host. You're witnessing what late-night television has become, he said. It's not about ideas, it's about control. Who gets to speak and who gets shouted down. Murmurs spread through the audience, a mix of discomfort and intrigue. No one had seen Maher lose the rhythm of his own show like this before. In the control room, the director barked, We need to decide now. Do we cut to commercial or ride this out? No one answered. On stage, Maher leaned forward, visibly frustrated. You're playing the victim again. You're a millionaire with a megaphone, Tucker. Save the martyr act. Carlson's reply was instant. I don't claim to be a victim. I'm just not pretending this is a conversation. 3 camera angles caught the moment from different sides, but none softened the blow. The performance was over. What remained was real, raw, and dangerously unscripted. Bill Maher's composure finally cracked. He slammed his hand lightly on the desk, a forced gesture meant to control the moment, but one that exposed the anger now rising in his chest. If you're not here for a real conversation, he said, voice tightening, then why did you even bother showing up? Tucker's response was immediate, cold, and calm. Because I believed you were still capable of one. The audience murmured again, this time with more discomfort than curiosity. Whatever civility remained was unraveling in real time. Maher stood up slightly, resting his hands on the edge of his desk, looming just enough to make a point without outright aggression. This is my show, he said sharply, and I won't be lectured by a man who's spent years gaslighting America for sport. Tucker didn't flinch. And I won't be a prop in your performance of righteousness, he said evenly. You brought me here for a takedown. You wanted a viral moment. And now that you're not getting it the way you rehearsed, you're melting down. The air in the studio felt electric, dangerous. The audience sat stiffly, some mouths open, others wide-eyed. Phones were up now. Every second was being captured. A producer off stage made the call. Gesture for security. It was a quiet nod, subtle but decisive. From stage left, 2 studio guards appeared in the shadows, waiting for the signal to move. Maher turned away from Carlson, visibly shaking his head, muttering something about never again. But before anyone could reclaim control, Tucker removed his mic clip, stood up slowly, and said, "I think we're done here." And with that, he stepped away from the desk. The studio didn't erupt into applause or boos, it just sat in stunned silence, witnessing the final fracture of a night that had gone far beyond anyone's script. As Tucker turned to walk off stage, the two security guards stepped forward instinctively, unsure whether to intervene or stand down. They hadn't been given a direct command, just a silent cue, one that now hovered uncertainly in the thick air. Carlson paused, catching sight of them in his periphery. He turned, looked them both in the eye, and said calmly, "Don't bother. I know the way out." One of the guards hesitated, then took a subtle step back. The other remained frozen, clearly caught between duty and discomfort. Bill Maher stayed seated, arms crossed, face blank. He didn't say a word. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't boo. They watched, paralyzed, as one of the most recognizable faces in political media walked off their favorite liberal talk show without a single final word from the host. The silence was deafening. A few people in the crowd looked to Maher, waiting for a quip, a closer, something to reset the mood. But nothing came. Just the sound of footsteps fading backstage and the low mechanical hum of the studio lights. Backstage, Carlson's assistant had already begun packing up. A producer attempted to intercept them, muttering something about finishing the episode, but she didn't even glance up. "You got what you wanted," she said flatly. "Hope the ratings are worth it." Meanwhile, in the control booth, a voice whispered, "Do we cut to a replay? Do we even have a segment left?" But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. The show wasn't ending with applause or a closing monologue. It was ending with a man walking away and a studio full of people realizing they'd just witnessed a cultural moment collapse under its own weight. Backstage, the hallway buzzed like a beehive. Producers scrambled between dressing rooms and headsets, trying to contain what had already spilled beyond the studio walls. Maher's head writer slammed his notepad onto a chair. "We lost control," he muttered, pacing. A junior segment producer was already on the phone with the network's PR team, trying to preempt the inevitable media firestorm. "We need to issue something now, anything, even if it's vague." But no one knew what angle to take because no one could pretend it hadn't happened. In Tucker's green room, silence ruled. His assistant handed him his phone, which was already lighting up with messages. "You're trending," she said quietly. "Clips are everywhere." Unedited Carlson didn't smile. He simply nodded, checked his collar in the mirror, and muttered, "They'll try to spin it." Just down the hallway, a heated argument erupted between Maher's executive producer and the floor manager. "You should have pulled it sooner." "And missed the ratings spike? You think HBO brought him on for a fireside chat?" The blame was already circulating like smoke in a burning house. Maher remained alone in his dressing room, slouched in a leather chair, drink in hand, staring blankly at the darkened monitor. The feed had cut to black. No outro. No final laugh. Just silence. His reflection in the screen looked smaller than usual. Less sure. He muttered, "He walked out." On my show. There was no audience left to diffuse the tension. No applause to cushion the moment. Only the dawning realization that something irreversible had happened. And it wasn't just about politics. It was about power. And who had just lost it? Within minutes of Tucker's walkout, the internet ignited. Raw cell phone footage flooded every major social media platform, clips that showed the final minutes of the exchange, unfiltered and brutal. Hashtags trended at lightning speed. #sign Tucker versus Maher, #sign Maher meltdown, and perhaps most damning, #sign uninvited exit. Twitter, Reddit, and YouTube became battlegrounds. Some praised Maher for holding Carlson accountable. Others called it a live ambush. But one sentiment rose above the noise. Nobody expected Carlson to walk out, and nobody expected Maher to let him. Commentators from both sides of the aisle scrambled to weigh in. Conservative voices hailed Carlson's composure, calling him the only adult in the room. Liberal pundits were split, some applauding Maher's challenge, others criticizing him for turning a tough interview into a televised trap. Memes, reaction videos, and side-by-side footage dissected every expression, every pause, every jab. The unedited studio feed, leaked by a rogue crew member, only intensified the narrative. This wasn't a staged clash. It was a genuine breakdown of control. Even other talk show hosts chimed in, some with thinly veiled jabs at Maher, others defending him with awkward solidarity. But behind all the hot takes, one truth emerged. This moment wasn't going away. Tucker's exit became symbolic, not just of media tension, but of how easily the veneer of civility can crack under real confrontation. It wasn't just a segment gone wrong. It was a cultural flashpoint, and millions had just watched it happen in real time. By the following morning, executives at HBO were already deep in crisis mode. Emails flew, phone lines buzzed. The network's legal and PR teams convened before sunrise to review the footage, assess liability, and craft a response that could contain the blaze now scorching across every corner of the internet. "We need to get ahead of this," one exec barked during the emergency call. "We either own it or become the villain in every headline." But owning it meant accepting they had aired a segment that spiraled into humiliation, and not for their guest. Internal memos began circulating with language like unexpected escalation and editorial misjudgment. Quiet calls were placed to Carlson's team, offering a retroactive olive branch, but his office declined to comment. Maher's staff, meanwhile, was told to halt any public posts and refrain from engaging online. The late-night format itself was suddenly under scrutiny. Ratings gold or not, this wasn't the kind of attention the network wanted heading into an election year. Executives weren't asking how to spin the fallout. They were asking how to survive it. Streaming platforms quickly repackaged the segment with softened language, placing content warnings before the playback. But it was too late. Millions had already seen the raw version, and edited copies only fueled more accusations of censorship and cover-up. Advertisers expressed quiet concern. Industry insiders whispered about whether Maher had finally crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. For the first time in years, the future of his show wasn't just debated on podcasts, it was being questioned in boardrooms. The storm hadn't passed. It was just beginning to touch down. 3 days later, Tucker Carlson broke his silence. Not on television, but on his own digital platform free from gatekeepers and editorial filters. Seated in front of a modest wooden desk with no audience and no applause, he delivered a calm but piercing message. "I went on that show expecting disagreement," he said. "I didn't expect deception." His tone was subdued, but every word was calculated. He didn't lash out, he dissected. And that made it all the more effective. Carlson didn't recount every detail. He didn't need to. The footage had already spoken for him. Instead, he reflected on the moment as symptomatic of a deeper issue. "We're living in an age where platforms aren't interested in conversation," he said. "They're interested in public humiliation masquerading as dialogue." His audience, millions strong, responded with immediate affirmation. Comment sections lit up with praise. Supporters framed his walkout as a dignified refusal to be baited into a circus. "He didn't storm off," one tweet read. "He stepped out with purpose." The impact was immediate. Donations to Carlson's media venture spiked. His name dominated headlines not as a provocateur, but as a man who refused to be provoked. Pundits who normally attacked him were forced to acknowledge one thing: he didn't crack. He didn't explode. He simply left. And in a media landscape addicted to chaos, that act, walking away, proved to be the loudest move of all. Carlson's silence had been strategic, but now that he was speaking again, it was clear. The narrative wouldn't be rewritten without a fight. Bill Maher returned to his next episode with a noticeably different tone. No smirking cold open, no self-congratulatory monologue. Just a quiet camera fade in and a seated Maher, looking more tired than triumphant. "So, about last week," he began, voice stripped of its usual bravado. What followed wasn't quite an apology, but it wasn't a deflection either. "Things got heated," he said. "We disagreed, that happens. But I've built this platform on pushing boundaries, and sometimes that includes testing them too hard." It was the closest he'd come to admitting fault in years. The response was mixed. Some praised him for showing restraint. Others called it performative damage control. Online, the reaction was swift and unforgiving. Commentators replayed his words, measuring each pause, each calculated phrase. He never said Tucker's name, never addressed the walkout directly. That silence didn't go unnoticed. A masterclass in not saying sorry, one blogger wrote. He's trying to reset the clock without rewinding the tape. Backstage, Maher's team was already fielding new guest cancellations. Names that had been confirmed weeks earlier were suddenly rescheduling. Meanwhile, HBO executives tightened their grip on content review. The message was clear. The leash was shorter now. Maher's brand had always been built on irreverence, but the Carlson debacle had exposed something different. Not just provocation, but perceived arrogance. And in a cultural moment hypersensitive to power dynamics, even a veteran like Maher wasn't safe from the shifting tide. He didn't lose the show, but he had lost something else. The invincibility, the control, and maybe the room. In the weeks that followed, the incident became less of a headline and more of a benchmark. Every media outlet, podcast, and late-night competitor referenced the Carlson walkout like a new chapter in an unspoken industry playbook. For Maher, the damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was lingering. Audience polls dipped slightly. Social media sentiment, once mostly in his favor, had turned cautious. The confrontation had exposed more than a rift between two men. It revealed how fragile the illusion of control really is on live television. Carlson, meanwhile, leaned into the narrative without milking it. He appeared on alternative shows discussing free speech and media hostility, but never exaggerating the walkout. He didn't need to. The footage remained evergreen, circulating with every new flare-up in the culture wars. His silence during Maher's vague non-apology only fueled the contrast. Carlson didn't have to return fire. He had already left the stage. And that, for many, was the final statement. So what do you think? Was Tucker Carlson justified in walking out, or did Bill Maher simply ask the wrong question? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and tell me who you want covered next. Because if this clash proved anything, it's that sometimes the biggest fireworks come not from shouting, but from silence that cuts deeper than words ever could.